Welcome to this video where we'll be looking at research approaches. The objective for this session is to understand the difference between deductive and inductive approaches to research. Deductive research involves the testing of a theoretical proposition by the employment of a research strategy specifically designed for the purpose of its testing. Deduction tests theory. Deduction generates propositions and hypotheses theoretically through a logically derived process. This is normally done through the literature review. So after reviewing the literature, it builds hypotheses which then the research seeks to test. So the process of deductive reasoning starts off with a theory, which we normally build and develop from reviewing the literature, then seek to develop a hypothesis or series of hypotheses to test whether these hypotheses are accurate or inaccurate in our context and scenario. So we normally have null and positive potential outcomes for the hypotheses we have developed. We then move on to observing the world around us by collecting data. And then once we have collected this data, we use this data to confirm whether the theories and hypotheses we have developed are accurate or not accurate. Induction is research which involves the development of a theory as a result of the observation of empirical data. So induction is focused on building theory rather than testing theory. Induction looks for patterns and associations derived from observations of the world. So with this approach, using inductive reasoning, we start off observing the world around us and collecting data to show what is happening. We then look at this data to look for any patterns that emerge within the data set we've collected. After we have found out if any patterns emerge, we look to draw tentative hypotheses based on these emerging patterns. And finally, we develop a theory based on the tentative hypotheses we've drawn. So we're starting off by observing the world and moving through this process to then generate and build a new theory, opposed to looking to test an existing theory. So these two research approaches of deduction and induction are related to the research philosophies we've previously discussed. So deduction normally fits well with the positivist goals of seeking a single truth. We can therefore test a theory to see whether the theory is true or not true. Also, deduction seeks and supports generalizability. We can generalize whether the answer to our hypotheses is true or not true, and then seek to generalize it across our sample. And also, we can seek to determine cause and effect relationships. Does X impact Y? Whereas induction normally fits well with the interpretivist goals of seeking multiple truths. We're seeking to build theory and patterns, and therefore there might be lots of different patterns which are emerging, not simply one pattern of X impacts Y, but rather there could be numerous different patterns within our sample, so it supports the researcher to seek for multiple truths. Induction also suits particularism and looking in depth within one example and context to provide particular answers which are not so generalizable to the whole sample, but rather we're seeking to build theory in this particular context or in this particular group of people or this particular environment, and therefore this allows more particular research findings rather than findings we're seeking to generalize across a whole population. And finally, induction supports looking in depth at complex, non-testable interrelationships. It's possible to look in depth and look for these multiple truths and see how they relate in different ways, and trying to break down the world to test so many interrelationships might not be possible. They're simply non-testable because we might not know what these relationships are until we have conducted this research. So when we're looking at research approaches and the type of data commonly used, quantitative data is often used for deduction because it is objective and it can support generalizability. Whereas qualitative data is often used for induction and theory building because we're looking for these complex interrelationships and multiple truths. And to do this, we need this more in-depth information to understand the different voices and the different answers to build new theory. However, both deduction and induction are useful in business research, depending on the research question. So it's important that you think carefully about your question as to whether you're trying to test an existing theory which you have found and developed from the literature, or are you trying to generate a new theory